You know that feeling perfectly well, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The room is just completely silent, and the only thing you can hear is the aggressive, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that suddenly sounds incredibly loud.
Like it's right next to your ear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're staring at this piece of paper or maybe a sterile computer screen, and your entire, your future prospects, your understanding of months of material, it all feels entirely reduced to a single letter grade.
Or just a stark percentage.
Right. And it's a profoundly universal human experience.
Yeah.
I mean, we all understand that visceral anxiety of the exam room. Your heart rate elevates, your palms might sweat.
You start breathing a little shallower. Yeah.
Yeah. We experience these tests as monolithic, almost divine judgments handed down from some unquestionable authority.
It is an incredibly intense environment to put a human being in, you know?
Yeah.
We treat the test as an absolute objective truth about our capabilities.
Right, like it's a permanent label.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We internalize that grade as a reflection of our actual identity, but the reality is actually far more mechanical than that.
Which is exactly what we're getting into today.
Right. A test is not an unassailable truth. It is simply a piece of technology. It's a machine built by humans, and like any machine, it has design flaws.
And intended functions, and definitely unintended consequences.
Huge unintended consequences.
So today, for this deep dive, we are going to dismantle that machine to see how the gears actually work.
I love that framing.
Thanks. We're unpacking the specific mechanics of testing, assessment, and evaluation. And while a lot of this originates from the world of language teaching, the underlying principles apply to literally any situation where human performance is measured.
Oh, universally. Whether you're learning a new language or going through an annual performance review at your corporate job.
Or even just trying to track your personal fitness goals on an app. Right?
Yeah, exactly. You are interacting with the architecture of testing.
Now, I do want to give a quick warning before we dive in.
Yeah.
This area of study is, well, it's pretty heavily littered with terminology.
Some might say infested with jargon.
Infested is a good word for it. But if we unpack this step by step, the complex, invisible architecture of measuring human knowledge actually stops being intimidating.
It really does. It becomes this fascinating lens to view human behavior through. And honestly, once you understand the mechanics of how a test is constructed, you can never unsee those mechanisms in your daily life.
I totally agree. So let's start dismantling. To understand the technology we use today, we really have to look at the blueprints from the past.
It's a history of it.
Yeah, specifically how our ambitions for testing have fundamentally shifted over the years, especially when it comes to measuring something as messy as human communication.
The historical evolution is pretty striking, mostly because it illustrates a massive shift in what educators and institutions thought was even physically possible.
Right, like what they could actually pull off.
Exactly. If you look back to the early 70s, around 1973, the prevailing attitude was one of profound skepticism. Experts at the time argued that testing true communicative competence was essentially just a logistical nightmare.
A total non-starter.
Yeah, their position was basically that the more ambitious we are in trying to evaluate real, spontaneous communication, the more administratively costly, subjective, and unreliable the whole thing becomes.
That feels like a starting point of pure defeat. Like, it's too hard to figure out if you can actually hold a conversation, so we're just not going to try.
That is precisely what it was. I mean, think about the infrastructure of the 1970s. Testing 1 million students on grammar rules using multiple choice questions is highly efficient.
Right, you just run it through a machine.
Exactly. But testing 1 million students on their ability to negotiate a complex social interaction in a second language, that requires thousands of highly trained human examiners.
Massive time investments.
Huge time investments. And you have to accept that different examiners might score the exact same conversation differently. So the focus was entirely on what was efficient to measure, rather than what was actually meaningful to the learner's real-world capability.
But there was a rapid pivot, right? Because just 6 years later, around 1979, the perspective completely flipped. The new consensus became that measuring communicative proficiency is a job worth doing, and actually feasible.
It represents a fundamental paradigm shift. Between 73 and 79, the global landscape was changing fast. International travel, global business.
Cross-cultural communication was just exploding.
Right. So the demand for people who could actually speak and understand a language in real time forced the testing industry to adapt. They couldn't just test verb conjugations on a chalkboard anymore.
They couldn't hide behind the excuse of administrative difficulty.
Exactly. The messy reality of human communication had to be measured, even if the tools were totally imperfect.
Which brings us to the final step in that sequence.
Yeah.
By 1989, it became the absolute baseline assumption. The consensus was just point blank. We want to test communicative ability.
The impossible nightmare of 1973 became the standard operating procedure by 1989. And this is a vital concept for anyone listening. We no longer value the mere accumulation of isolated facts.
Right. We value the application of those facts.
Exactly. We want to know if you can use the knowledge, synthesize it, and communicate it under actual pressure.
But that ambition requires incredible precision, which brings us directly into the semantics of measurement. We throw around words like assess, evaluate, and test like they're completely interchangeable.
Oh, all the time.
I actually looked up the definitions on Google before we started, just to see what the average person finds.
Uh-oh. I imagine the results were less than illuminating.
It is a perfect circle of confusion. If you ask a search engine to define assess, it tells you to evaluate or estimate the nature or quality of.
And then if you look up evaluate,
It tells you to form an idea of the value of. Assess. The dictionary literally uses the words to define each other.
of course it does. In conversational English, that overlap is perfectly fine. But in the architecture of education and institutional measurement, treating those words as synonyms leads to massive structural confusion.
Because they're completely different tools.
They are distinct tools designed for very different purposes. The framework separates them quite clearly.
Let's pull them apart then. Start with assessment. What separates an assessment from a general evaluation?
The defining characteristic of assessment is external measurement that results in a formal record.
Okay.
When we talk about giving people a formal task, quantifying their performance, and recording those scores on a spreadsheet or a report card, that is an assessment procedure.
So it's always external.
The critical element is that someone else, an external entity, is measuring your success against their specific metric.
Right. So assessment is the official documented record. It's the grade on the transcript. How does evaluation differ then?
Evaluation is much broader. It's a more holistic and fundamentally reflective process. It involves looking back over a course of study or a corporate project and asking, what went well? What was genuinely learned?
So it pulls from a wider variety of inputs. It isn't just about a final score.
Not at all. It can include formal testing data, sure, but it also includes qualitative impressions. A manager observing an employee handle a difficult client call is gathering evaluative data.
Even informally.
Yeah, even in a classroom, a teacher simply making eye contact with a student and nodding to accept an answer is a micro form of evaluation.
I see.
The key difference lies in the origin and purpose. When we measure success for ourselves to improve our own future performance, we are evaluating. When an external body measures us to produce a recorded metric, we are being assessed.
Okay, I was trying to conceptualize this difference earlier, and I thought of how we interact with media. Like, imagine I go to the theater to see a new movie.
Okay.
When I come out, I'm talking to a friend about the cinematography, the pacing, the chemistry between the leads. I'm noting if the audience in the theater seemed engaged. That conversation is an evaluation.
Right, because it's holistic and qualitative.
Exactly. And the assessment in that scenario would be the box office gross published on Monday morning.
Oh, that's a very robust analogy.
Right. It's cold, hard data. It's a recorded metric decided by external variables, and it determines whether the studio considers the movie a financial success or a failure, regardless of the artistic pacing I was evaluating. Evaluation is the review, assessment is the box office.
That perfectly captures the distinction between the holistic experience and the recorded metric. But of course, there is a third term that complicates this neat division.
Testing.
Testing.
So if evaluation is the comprehensive review and assessment is the hard box office data, where does a pop quiz fit into that structure?
Testing is the chameleon here. A test is simply a tool, a specific mechanism for gathering data. How that tool is categorized depends entirely on how the data is used.
So the tool itself is neutral until it's applied.
Precisely. If a test is informal and classroom-based, like a teacher giving a short, ungraded pop quiz to see if the reading material was understood, it functions as part of the evaluation process.
This is just checking the temperature of the room.
Right. The teacher is evaluating their own lesson plan. However, if a test is formal, externally administered, and results in a permanent grade, like a standardized national exam, it leans entirely over into assessment.
Which is often referred to as examining.
Exactly.
That dual nature makes perfect sense. To a student, a biweekly progress test might feel like a high-stakes assessment that causes massive anxiety. But to the teacher, it's just a low-stakes tool for evaluating whether the curriculum is actually working.
The anxiety really comes from misunderstanding the purpose of the tool.
And understanding the purpose of the tool leads us to the broader philosophical question here. We've defined the terms, but we have to ask, why do we subject ourselves to these mechanisms?
Why do institutions dedicate so much time to it?
Yeah, there's a foundational concept from Peter Drucker that essentially boils down to, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it.
It is a profound, albeit somewhat mechanistic view of human progress. You can design the most brilliant, innovative corporate training module imaginable, but without a structured measurement mechanism, you are operating entirely on assumptions.
You have absolutely no verifiable way of knowing if those objectives are translating into actual capability.
Exactly. Measurement provides the essential feedback loop for reality.
But the way we apply that feedback loop creates one of the most significant divides in the entire philosophy of testing. The timing and the intention dictate its impact. The framework breaks this down into three main categories of evaluation: initial, summative, and formative.
Right. Initial evaluation is the most straightforward. As the name suggests, it occurs before the primary learning begins.
To establish a baseline.
Yeah. This often takes the form of a diagnostic test, which helps a manager or teacher formulate a plan by identifying what the individuals already know and where their gaps are.
It's mapping the territory before you start the journey, like a placement test.
Yes, placement tests are a great example. They are purely administrative. If you enroll in a language school, they need to know if you belong in the beginner room or the advanced room. Placing a student incorrectly is disastrous for everyone.
That seems entirely logical. But the real friction, the area where testing becomes a psychological burden, is the battleground between summative and formative evaluation.
Summative evaluation is the grand finale. Its entire purpose is to measure how well a specific set of objectives has been achieved at the absolute end of period of instruction.
Like Judgment Day.
It really is. It's the final exam. It's the end-of-year corporate performance review. It is characterized by the assignment of permanent grades and the issuance of reports detailing success or failure.
And it's frequently a demotivating and unhappy experience for learners.
Because the data gathered is rarely used to help the individual improve, the course is over. The grade is final. It's purely a sorting mechanism for the institution to decide who moves forward. Contrast that stark reality with formative evaluation.
Formative evaluation feels like the antidote to that anxiety. It doesn't happen at the end, it occurs continuously throughout the program.
The timing is critical, yes, but the intention is even more important. Formative evaluation gathers information, but that information is not used to assign a permanent, punitive grade.
What's it used for, then?
It's used to supply both the learner and the teacher with immediate, actionable evidence about how learning is developing in the present moment.
So it focuses on the trajectory, not just the final destination.
Often referred to as Assessment for Learning, or AFL. The primary goal is adjustment. It allows a teacher to pivot their lesson midstream if the room is confused. And crucially, it allows learners to recognize their own misunderstandings before a final judgment is made.
There's an analogy by a researcher named Robert Stake that crystallizes this difference perfectly. It is honestly one of the most effective metaphors I ever heard. He says, when the cook tastes the soup, that's formative. When the guests taste the soup, that's summative.
It brilliantly distills a complex pedagogical theory into an everyday action. The cook tasting the soup is actively gathering data to make an immediate adjustment.
The soup is still simmering on the stove.
Right. The cook notes it lacks salt, adds the salt, and tastes it again. The process is fluid, ongoing, and the ultimate outcome is a superior product. That is formative evaluation in action.
But the moment that soup leaves the kitchen and is placed in front of the guests in the dining room, the cooking process is entirely over. The guests are not tasting the soup to adjust the seasoning. They are tasting it to render a final verdict.
The soup is excellent or the soup is terrible.
You earn an A or you earn an F. You cannot retroactively unsalt the soup while sitting at the dinner table.
The opportunity for improvement has passed, and only judgment remains. And the research overwhelmingly supports the idea that the cook tasting the soup is vastly superior when the goal is actual human development.
It's almost presented like a manifesto for better learning. It inherently makes teaching more effective because you're operating on real-time data rather than assumptions.
And it has a demonstrably positive effect on achievement. When a massive goal is broken down into achievable small steps with constant feedback, the human brain processes the challenge much more efficiently.
It strips the mystery away. If the cook realizes it needs garlic, the path forward is clear. If the guest merely hands the cook a piece of paper that says C- soup, The cook has learned absolutely nothing about how to improve for the next meal.
That feedback loop acts as a powerful corrective measure. It identifies and neutralizes misunderstandings immediately. Plus, formative assessment is inherently cooperative. It encourages learners to collaborate, to engage in peer evaluation.
Which ultimately leads to autonomy, right? By constantly evaluating the process, learners acquire the skill of self-assessment. They learn how to identify their own weaknesses.
That autonomy is the holy grail of education. You are teaching the individual how to teach themselves.
Which brings up a massive structural contradiction. If the research so clearly demonstrates that formative assessment empowers learners and leads to better outcomes, why is our global educational infrastructure and our corporate culture so completely obsessed with summative assessment?
That is the million-dollar question.
Why are we constantly forcing institutions to serve the soup to the guests before the cook has had any real opportunity to perfect the recipe?
The answer lies in the harsh realities of scale and institutional necessity. Formative assessment is incredibly effective, but it is also messy, highly individualized, and incredibly time-consuming.
It requires human bandwidth.
Bandwidth that most systems simply do not possess. When a university system has to process applications from tens of thousands of students, or a massive corporation has to decide on annual bonuses for a global workforce, they cannot rely on nuanced qualitative narratives about a person's learning trajectory.
They need a clean, sortable metric.
They need a GPA. They need a standardized test score. Summative assessment provides the bureaucratic machine with the hard data it requires to function efficiently.
So we are essentially sacrificing the optimal method of human development for the most efficient method of administrative sorting. We test for the convenience of the filing cabinet, not for the benefit of the brain.
It is a fundamental systemic tension. However, understanding that this tension exists provides you with a massive strategic advantage.
How so?
If you recognize that the summative test at the end of a process is primarily a bureaucratic necessity, you can take ownership of your own development. You can purposefully build formative checkpoints into your own workflow, seeking out feedback long before the final evaluation.
You have to become the cook in your own kitchen. Don't wait for the guest to tell you if the soup is good. Taste your own soup constantly.
Taste your own soup. That is the practical takeaway.
That philosophical grounding transitions us perfectly into the mechanical classifications of these tests. We need to examine the specific categories of measurement and the profound behavioral consequences they trigger.
Because the architecture of the test fundamentally alters the experience of the test taker.
Let's look at the contrast between objective and subjective assessment. This is where we start getting into the mechanics of grading.
This distinction revolves entirely around the role of human judgment in the marking process. Objective testing utilizes formats where there is only one undeniable, mathematically correct answer.
Like multiple choice questions or true-false.
Exactly. The defining feature is that the result is absolute. It is completely immune to the mood, bias, or personal preference of the person grading it. A machine can grade an objective test perfectly.
There's a certain comfort in that absolute clarity. It feels incredibly safe from human error.
It provides tremendous safety from marker bias, and it is highly efficient. Subjective testing, however, operates at the opposite end of the spectrum. The tasks are open-ended.
Writing an analytical essay or an unstructured oral interview.
Right. The grading relies heavily, sometimes entirely, on the marker's professional judgment, interpretation of a rubric, and subjective impression.
And while subjective testing introduces the risk of human bias, it's really the only way to measure complex, synthesized skills. I mean, a machine can verify if you know the capital of France, but a human has to judge if your essay arguing about the economic policies of France is actually persuasive.
Precisely. The complexity of the task necessitates a subjective human evaluation. However, the classification that carries the most profound psychological weight for the learner is the difference between criterion-referenced testing and norm-referenced testing.
This specific division completely alters the reality of the exam room. Let's start with criterion-referenced tests. How does the system operate?
In a criterion-referenced system, a candidate's performance is measured exclusively against a fixed, predetermined objective standard, the criteria. Your score is completely independent of external variables, including the performance of anyone else taking the test.
Like a standard driving test. When you slide into the driver's seat, the examiner holds a clipboard outlining specific criteria. Did you use your turn signal? Did you parallel park within the lines? Did you come to a complete stop?
If you satisfy those criteria, you are granted your license. It's a binary outcome based on the standard. Crucially, it does not matter if the person who took the test immediately before you was a professional race car driver and the person after you has never seen a steering wheel.
Your performance is judged in a vacuum. You are competing against the standard, not against your peers.
Exactly.
That creates a somewhat supportive environment. If we all meet the standard, we all get licenses. But norm referencing operates under an entirely different, much more cutthroat philosophy.
Norm referencing is a system designed to measure candidates not against a fixed standard, but against each other. The goal is to establish a ranking. Grading on a curve is the most common example of this.
Imagine a highly competitive university program that decides only the top 10% of the incoming class will be permitted to advance to the second year.
In that scenario, the test isn't just asking, did you understand the material? It is asking, did you understand the material slightly better than the person sitting to your left?
The criteria for success become fluid. You could score a 95% on the exam, demonstrating massive mastery. But if the rest of the class scores a 96%, in a norm reference system, you fail.
Your massive mastery is irrelevant because the system requires a bottom percentage.
That fundamentally shifts the psychology of the learning environment. It breeds intense, toxic competition. Because my success mathematically requires someone else's failure. Imagine if the DMV decided to issue licenses using a norm-referenced curve.
Oh, that would be terrifying.
Even if every single person on the road drove perfectly, followed every rule, the system would still artificially dictate that 90% of those perfect drivers lose their licenses today simply because they weren't the most perfect. It would be absolute chaos.
It creates chaos, anxiety, and a highly defensive posture toward learning. Yet many elite institutions and massive tech corporations utilize norm referencing, often called stack ranking, to manage their populations.
They justify it as a mechanism for identifying elite talent, but the psychological toll is profound.
So, the architecture of the test actively shapes the behavior within that environment, which introduces us to one of the most powerful theoretical concepts here, the washback effect.
Sometimes referred to as backwash. This is an absolutely critical concept for understanding how systems operate. Washback describes the phenomenon where the format, content, and stakes of an upcoming test directly dictate and alter the teaching and learning processes that occur before the test is ever administered.
It is the concept of teaching to the test elevated to a systemic rule.
Right. Human nature dictates a path of efficiency.
Exactly. If a teacher and a classroom of students know the exact parameters of a high-stakes examination, they will naturally concentrate all their time and energy on training specifically to perform well within those parameters.
They will optimize for the test, often at the complete expense of learning the broader subject matter. The tail wags the dog. The measurement tool dictates the curriculum.
There's a famous quote from former U.S. President George W. Bush regarding education policy. You teach a child to read, and he or her will be able to pass a literacy test.
I want to examine the underlying logic of that statement. The logic assumes a natural, sequential flow of knowledge. Genuine, holistic learning leads naturally to passing the test. If you possess the internal skill, the external test will accurately reflect it.
Right, that's the assumption.
But the concept of the washback effect implies the exact opposite dynamic. Washback suggests that the test artificially controls, limits, and distorts the learning process. So the question becomes, can a test ever truly function as a neutral mirror reflecting reality? Or is the mirror always distorting the light?
That is the essential philosophical problem of testing. The reality is that a test is almost never a neutral mirror, particularly when the stakes attached to the outcome are high.
Because tests are inherently limited instruments, they can only ever sample a tiny fraction of total knowledge.
They are low-resolution snapshots of a high-resolution reality. Imagine a standardized literacy test that, for the sake of administrative efficiency, only measures reading speed and vocabulary recall via multiple-choice questions.
It completely ignores deep reading comprehension, or the ability to synthesize complex arguments.
Exactly. The washback effect guarantees that teachers, knowing their own evaluations depend on those test scores, will abandon deep reading exercises. They will fill the curriculum with speed reading drills and vocabulary flashcards.
Because optimizing for the test metrics becomes the primary directive. The test doesn't reflect the reality of the classroom. It manufactures a new, narrower reality.
The format of the test becomes the de facto syllabus. This happens in corporate environments constantly. If a customer service representative is evaluated strictly on the metric of average call time, the washback effect guarantees they will rush customers off the phone.
Providing terrible service while perfectly satisfying the metric, The measurement tool fundamentally alters the behavior.
So if these tools possess the power to reshape behavior, we need to inspect the actual mechanisms they use. We need to open the toolbox. How do test makers actually engineer these questions to extract data from a human brain?
The arsenal of testing is vast. Let's look at the broad institutional intentions first. We have aptitude tests, which are fascinating because they attempt to measure potential rather than history.
They do not test what you have already learned. They attempt to quantify your innate cognitive ability to learn a specific new skill in the future.
The military utilizes these heavily, right? Like, designed to see if a recruit has the mental wiring to quickly learn a critical foreign language before the military invests thousands of dollars in training them.
Exactly, it measures predictive capacity. Then we have achievement tests, which are backward-looking. They measure your performance at the culmination of a specific period of study.
That's your classic end-of-semester history exam. And what about proficiency tests? How do those differ from achievement tests?
An achievement test is tied to a specific syllabus. It asks, did you learn what we taught you in this specific room? A proficiency test is untethered from any specific course. It measures your overall general ability in a subject.
Like the TOEFL or IELTS for languages, they just ask, can you operate at this level?
Right. And finally, we have barrier tests.
Which sounds incredibly imposing, like a gatekeeper.
A barrier test acts precisely as a gatekeeper. It is designed specifically to determine if an individual is adequately prepared to be admitted into a highly demanding, specialized course or profession. The bar exam for lawyers or medical board exams function as barrier tests.
Those are the macro categories. But when you zoom in on the actual piece of paper, the individual test items have their own distinct architecture. And some of them contain massive structural loopholes.
Yes, the basic item types. Let's start with alternate response.
That's the technical term for your standard true or false binary. But there's a delightful technicality regarding test design here. If a test maker attempts to be nuanced by offering true, false, or don't know, the format ceases to be an alternate response test.
The addition of that third variable technically transforms it into a multiple choice item.
Which transitions us to the multiple choice format, or fixed response testing. You have the single mathematically correct answer hidden among several incorrect options. And the terminology the industry uses for those incorrect options is fascinating. They call them distractors.
The creation of a highly effective distractor is an absolute art form in test engineering. A poor distractor is obvious and easily eliminated, which makes the test too easy.
A brilliant distractor is engineered to be highly plausible.
Exactly. It specifically targets common misconceptions. It is designed to attract the individuals who possess partial knowledge but lack true mastery, while remaining clearly incorrect to the true expert.
The test maker is essentially laying psychological traps based on common human errors. Moving beyond fixed choices, we encounter structured response items.
In a structured response task, the candidate is required to generate language or information, but within a highly rigid, predetermined frame, like completing a fill-in-the-blank sentence where only one specific grammatical form works.
Or an essay prompt that mandates the inclusion of a specific list of vocabulary words. The freedom is tightly constrained.
Which brings us to the opposite end of that spectrum: free response items. The test provides a general rubric or a broad prompt, but the candidate has total freedom to write or speak however they choose.
Write a 500-word essay detailing your perspective on climate change. You would logically assume that providing a candidate with total freedom is the most authentic way to witness the full extent of their capabilities.
However, there's a profound psychological insight here. Free response tasks are inherently error-avoiding.
This insight completely shifted my perspective on testing. It is a fundamental flaw in unstructured measurement. When I realized this, it instantly triggered a memory of being a tourist in a foreign restaurant.
Oh, this is a great analogy.
Let's imagine I am in Paris. I desperately want to order the chicken. But under the pressure of the moment, I realize I cannot remember the French word for chicken. However, I am absolutely confident in the French word for beef. So I smoothly, confidently, and flawlessly order the beef.
And to the waiter observing you, your performance appears perfectly fluent. You navigated the interaction without a single grammatical error or hesitation.
Exactly. But the entire performance was a sophisticated illusion. By giving me total freedom to order whatever I wanted, the conversational test completely failed to expose the massive gap in my vocabulary.
You utilized your freedom to intentionally steer the conversation away from your areas of weakness.
I remained safely within my areas of competence. I ordered the beef.
That restaurant analogy perfectly encapsulates the danger of free response. The more freedom you grant a test subject, the more capable they become of unconsciously or highly consciously avoiding the concepts they are unsure of.
It's essentially a manual on how to game an unstructured test. You just talk confidently about the specific things you know, and the examiner has no idea what you don't know.
Precisely. Free response tests are excellent at measuring what a candidate can do, but they systematically fail to measure what a candidate cannot do. This is why a highly structured response is often far superior for extracting accurate diagnostic data.
If a prompt says, write an essay proposing improvements, and you must specifically detail changes to the cafeteria, you eliminate the escape routes. You force the test taker out of their linguistic comfort zone.
You force them to try and order the chicken.
You have to force them to order the chicken.
Beyond the specific item types, we also have to look at the broader methodology of how a test is administered and graded, contrasting direct testing with indirect testing.
Direct testing is intuitively logical. If your objective is to determine whether a candidate can write a persuasive discursive essay, you simply ask them to write a discursive essay.
You directly test the exact real-world outcome. That seems like the obvious approach. Why would anyone use indirect testing, which sounds inherently sneaky?
Indirect testing operates on the premise of deconstruction. It attempts to test the underlying foundational micro-abilities that theoretically combine to create the macro skill.
So instead of asking a candidate to write a time-consuming essay, an indirect test might present a rapid-fire series of multiple-choice questions focusing exclusively on paragraph structure and grammar rules. The assumption being that if you possess all the individual ingredients, you automatically possess the ability to bake the complex cake.
Knowing the ingredients does not make you a chef.
Exactly. And that is the subject of intense debate within the field. Direct testing is universally considered more authentic, but it is incredibly subjective, expensive, and time-consuming for humans to grade.
Whereas indirect testing is incredibly fast, mathematically objective, and can be graded by a computer in milliseconds. Efficiency often overrides authenticity.
That tension mirrors the divide between discrete point testing and integrative testing. Discrete point testing is a barrage of highly isolated questions. It tests one single grammar rule, then one single vocabulary word.
Integrative testing requires the candidate to combine multiple elements simultaneously to navigate a larger, more complex task.
And the grading mechanisms for these methodologies are equally complex. Within the realm of subjective marking, we have to distinguish between analytic and holistic marking.
How do those subjective methods differ in practice?
In analytic marking, the human grader uses a highly detailed rubric to break the performance down into separate, isolated scores. An essay might receive a 4 for grammar, a 3 for vocabulary range, and a 5 for structural coherence.
It provides detailed feedback.
Right. Holistic marking, conversely, asks the grader to absorb the entire piece and assign one single overarching score based on their general overall impression of the work's effectiveness.
So you're essentially building a custom machine. You select your broad test category, you design your specific item types, you choose a direct or indirect methodology, and you calibrate your marking scheme.
It's a lot of moving parts.
But once you have assembled this complex measurement machine, how do you verify that it actually functions correctly in the real world? This question brings us to the absolute core of the deep dive. We are looking at the holy trinity of testing.
Reliability, validity, and practicality. These are the three fundamental pillars that dictate whether any test is actually worth the paper it is printed on.
Let's begin with the most grounded logistical pillar, practicality. This isn't about educational theory. This is about reality.
Practicality asks a very blunt question. Is this highly engineered test actually deliverable in the real world? It does not matter if a team of psychometricians has designed a flawlessly valid assessment if the test requires 5 hours to administer and specialized equipment to take.
Nobody will use it. For massive examining bodies processing millions of candidates, practicality is often the ultimate overriding concern. The test must be relatively cheap to produce, easily distributed, and rapidly graded.
But that demand for practicality frequently collides with the second pillar of the Trinity. Reliability.
Reliability is the domain of the statisticians, right?
It refers entirely to the consistency of the measurement tool. It seeks to answer the crucial test-retest question. If a candidate takes your exam in a quiet room in London on a Monday morning, and then takes the exact same exam in a crowded hall in Kuala Lumpur on a Tuesday afternoon, would the test produce the exact same result?
Assuming, of course, that they didn't furiously study the material on the flight over.
Precisely. A truly reliable test isolates the candidate's actual knowledge and produces consistent data regardless of external environmental variables or the specific human grading the paper.
But achieving that consistency is incredibly difficult. You have to control an astonishing number of variables.
It is an ongoing battle against entropy. To maintain reliability, test administrators must attempt to stabilize the physical circumstances, mandating specific noise levels, desk spacing, and even room temperature.
They have to ensure absolute marking uniformity, training human graders, so they all apply the exact same level of strictness to a subjective essay.
They must also develop parallel versions of the test that are mathematically proven to be genuinely equal in difficulty.
So a test compromised in one time zone doesn't ruin the global curve. There's a specific point regarding quantity and its relationship to reliability that I found really provocative. It's argued that, mathematically speaking, longer tests are inherently more reliable because generating more evidence leads to a more consistent judgment.
It uses the analogy of sports tournaments. You don't decide the winner of the World Cup with a single sudden death game of rock, paper, scissors.
You play a massive month-long tournament with dozens of games to gather enough data to definitively identify the true champion.
The logic is sound. The longer an examination is, the more diverse areas of knowledge the test can cover, and the less likely it becomes that a student will receive a wildly skewed final score simply because they got lucky on 2 questions. A larger data set smooths out the anomalies.
But I have to question the practical limits of this quantity rule. If making a test longer continuously gathers better data, isn't there an inevitable physiological tipping point? A moment in the exam room where we stop measuring the student's actual knowledge and we simply start measuring their physical endurance or how much caffeine they consumed that morning.
That is a highly documented phenomenon. There is an explicit warning that the major downside of pursuing reliability through quantity is the human factor. As a test drags on into hour 3 or hour 4, candidates become tired and dispirited.
When a student reaches a state of cognitive exhaustion, the errors they make are no longer reflecting a lack of subject knowledge. They are reflecting neurological fatigue.
Therefore, if a test is pushed too long, the actual reliability drops off a cliff because the data becomes corrupted by exhaustion.
It is an incredibly delicate balancing act. Now, the final pillar of the Trinity is perhaps the most philosophically complex: validity.
If practicality is the primary concern of the administrators and reliability is the obsession of the statisticians, validity is the ultimate goal of the educators. Validity asks the fundamental question: does this measurement tool actually measure what it claims to measure?
Which sounds incredibly obvious on the surface, but validity fractures down into 5 distinct, highly nuanced subcategories. Let's do a deep dive within our deep dive here to explore how complex this gets. The first category is face validity.
Face validity is entirely about perception, psychology, and trust. Does the test appear to be a fair, serious, and accurate assessment to the people taking it?
For example, a highly experienced teacher might be able to accurately gauge a student's fluency level simply by having a casual 5-minute chat with them in the hallway.
But the student, conditioned by years of formal education, will not feel that they have been properly assessed. They expect a silent room, a printed booklet, and a ticking clock. If a testing mechanism lacks face validity, if it feels too casual, the students might not take it seriously, and the resulting data is ruined.
The test essentially has to look the part to function correctly. It reminds me of corporate job interviews. A company might get better data by watching a candidate solve a puzzle in a relaxed setting, but the candidate expects a formal panel interview in a boardroom. If they don't get the boardroom, they feel the process is illegitimate.
The next category is content validity.
Right. Does the assessment contain a highly relevant and perfectly representative sample of what was actually taught in the curriculum?
If a teacher spends a 6-week course heavily focused on writing formal business emails, and the final exam suddenly asks the students to compose a creative poetry stanza, that test possesses 0 content validity. It is testing extraneous material that was not part of the agreement.
That scenario is the ultimate, universally understood student nightmare. Sitting down at the desk, flipping the paper over, and realizing we did not cover a single word of this in class.
The feeling of betrayal is immense. The third category is predictive validity.
We touched on this concept when discussing barrier tests, predictive validity attempts to answer. Does the score achieved on this test accurately predict how well the candidate will succeed in a future, unrelated environment?
Establishing true predictive validity is an agonizingly long process. You have to administer the test to a large cohort, allow them to enter the demanding university program or corporate role, wait several years, and then conduct a retroactive data analysis to see if the individuals with high test scores actually performed better in the real world.
It's essentially demanding that a piece of paper function as a highly accurate crystal ball. And we know how flawed those predictive gatekeeping exams can be when evaluating actual human potential, which leads to the fourth category, concurrent validity.
Concurrent validity is essentially a systemic shortcut. Imagine an institution relies on a massive, highly respected proficiency exam that takes 4 hours to complete and costs hundreds of dollars to administer. The institution desires a cheaper, faster, 1-hour alternative.
So they design a new test.
To prove the new test works, they administer both the 4-hour test and the 1-hour test to a sample group simultaneously. If the scores on the short test closely mirror the scores on the long test, the new test has achieved high concurrent validity. It provides the same data for a fraction of the cost.
The final category is the most difficult to pin down. Construct validity. A construct is fundamentally something that happens invisibly inside the human brain, like fluency or intelligence. How does a test achieve construct validity?
To achieve high construct validity, the designer of the test must be able to aggressively and succinctly answer the question. What exact construct are you attempting to isolate and test?
And simply answering, "I am testing writing ability," is completely insufficient.
It is insufficient because it immediately begs a cascade of far more specific questions. Are you testing writing at an intermediate or advanced level, concerning academic topics or casual social interactions? Designed for an audience of peers or an audience of superiors, utilizing a constraint of 50 words or 5,000 words.
If a test maker cannot provide a highly specific, well-reasoned answer to every single one of those clarifying questions, they do not possess construct validity. They are not testing a specific construct. They are just throwing darts in the dark and hoping to hit a cognitive target.
The sheer amount of invisible engineering that goes into constructing a single valid test question is staggering. And speaking of that engineering, there are 2 specific design principles that test makers utilize to protect this fragile trinity of reliability and validity. The first principle is a concept called fresh starts.
This is a brilliant structural concept designed to protect candidates from a phenomenon known as cascading failure. A well-engineered test should never be strictly cumulative in its dependency.
Let me break down how a cumulative dependency creates a trap. Imagine sitting for an exam composed of 2 linked tasks. Task 1 requires you to read a highly complex, dense text about a European train schedule and answer multiple comprehension questions.
Okay.
Task 2 then explicitly requires you to utilize the specific vocabulary and information you supposedly learned in that train schedule text to write a short essay.
Oh, the structural flaw is immediately apparent.
It is a massive trap. If a student completely fails to comprehend the dense reading text in Task 1, they are now physically and fundamentally incapable of completing Task 2, regardless of how excellent their general writing ability might be.
They suffer a double penalty for a single point of failure.
Conversely, if the reading text happens to be about trains and the student is a massive train enthusiast, they have an unfair advantage that carries over into the second section. They get double lucky.
So Task 2 entirely fails to measure the construct of writing ability. It simply measures whether the student survived the ambush of Task 1.
Exactly. It completely destroys both the validity of the construct and the reliability of the score. That is why every single item on a well-designed test must constitute a fresh start. No candidate should be permanently advantaged or fatally disadvantaged throughout the entire exam based on their performance on one isolated element.
They must be given multiple independent opportunities to demonstrate their capability. The final design principle we need to look at is a concept that sounds inherently terrible when applied to general society, but is apparently an absolute necessity in the hyperspecific world of testing: discrimination.
In a broader societal context, discrimination is obviously a profound negative. But in the highly mathematical specific realm of test engineering, discrimination is a vital mechanical virtue.
In this context, discrimination refers entirely to the test's ability to clearly, finely, and accurately distinguish between different capability levels within a cohort of learners.
It is the sorting hat function of the machine. It needs to figure out who goes where. Consider the extremes. If a test is designed so poorly that it is far too easy, every single person in the room scores 100%.
That outcome might be fantastic for immediate classroom morale, but it is utterly useless from a data perspective.
The test has completely failed to discriminate. It cannot tell the teacher who is genuinely excelling and who is merely competent. Conversely, if a test is impossibly hard and everyone fails, the data is equally useless.
A perfectly engineered testing machine includes highly calibrated questions, specifically referred to as discriminators, that are intentionally designed to be solvable only by the absolute top percentile of students in the cohort.
The inclusion of these discriminators stretches the final scores out, creating a clear, readable spectrum of data rather than a clustered mess.
Let's bring all of these complex threads together. We have journeyed through an incredibly dense landscape today. We started with the cynical history of the 1970s, where educators viewed testing human communication as an administrative nightmare.
We navigated the circular, confusing definitions provided by search engines and untangled the crucial differences between assessment as an external box office metric and evaluation as an internal, holistic review.
We uncovered the profound realization that managing our own growth, whether learning a language, mastering a new skill for a corporate role, or simply pursuing a personal hobby, requires us to constantly distinguish between the paralyzing anxiety of summative grades and the empowering continuous feedback loop of formative tasting the soup.
We've also explored how tests are far from neutral mirrors. They are highly engineered, frequently flawed mechanisms that must constantly balance the brutal logistical demands of practicality against the rigorous statistical needs of reliability and the pedagogical ideals of validity.
And perhaps most importantly, we examined the washback effect, revealing how the very format of these measurement machines can literally dictate and alter how human beings behave and learn, which leads us to our final thought for this deep dive.
Right.
The overarching mission of our show is to help you, the listener, approach the systems in your own life with a much sharper, more strategic and critical eye.
The washback effect doesn't just happen in high school classrooms. We have seen how tests dictate curriculums, but we must apply that concept to our daily existence. Think deeply about your own life and your own routines. What specific metrics or tests are you currently using to measure your personal or professional success?
Is your metric your annual salary? Is it your corporate job title? Is it the number of likes or views on a piece of content you posted?
Are you unconsciously imposing a brutal norm reference test on your own life? Constantly and unfairly comparing your messy, behind-the-scenes reality to the highly curated, perfect highlight reels of everyone else around you?
That is the critical question. Are those self-imposed, highly flawed assessments creating a negative washback effect on how you actually experience your day-to-day life?
Are you subtly altering your behavior, your passions, or your goals just to ensure you pass a poorly designed, highly subjective societal test of success?
Or, and I hope it's this one, are you choosing to be the cook? Are you actively tasting the soup along the way? Are you utilizing formative, ongoing, gentle check-ins to continuously adjust the recipe of your life, learning from small errors without waiting for the final, terrifying, summative judgment of the guests?
It ultimately comes down to a question of authorship. Who is designing the rubric that you are choosing to live by?
I love that thought. Who designed your rubric? Keep questioning the invisible architecture of measurement that surrounds you. The next time you find yourself in that silent room, whether it's a literal exam hall or a metaphorical moment of high pressure, listening to that ticking clock, remember, the test is not an absolute truth, it's just a machine. And now you know exactly how the gears turn.